Good afternoon, fellow Plexers. Today's video is going to try to help inform Nicholas from the Plex Pals Facebook support group. And he has a Asustor 6th Gen 2 NAS. His Plex server is running on a 8th or 9th Gen Dell Optiplex that's in his TV cabinet. And then he mostly uses either an NVIDIA Shield or the proprietary Samsung app to view Plex. And he does have a little bit of buffering here and there. So he asked a lot of questions to see if he understood things properly. And I want to address all of them, but before I do, I wanted to pull up his NAS. Now, I have a lot of experience with Synology NASs. My first Plex server, my first real Plex server after screwing around, was on a Synology DS 1019 Plus NAS. And to help fix all the problems I made during my first year of that, I bought a DS 1520 Plus NAS with a little bit better iGPU in it, so I could start fresh and slowly move things over. And I had already caught in the Plex addiction bug at that point, and I knew I wanted my older NAS to be an off-site backup unit only. I'm still waiting to move it off-site once one of my kids gets gig fiber access up and down, but eventually it will be offset. So I have lots of experience on the Synology side, and I viewed a Plex install under a Asustor NAS, and it's just as easy basically. So what I want to point out first of all, before I get into the questions and answer part of this, is that Nicholas' NAS has this Intel Celeron N5105 CPU in it, which has its own iGPU that can be used for Plex accelerated transcoding. Many of us with a Synology NAS, one of the 920 series or one of the 20 series, like a 220, 420, 720, 920, or the 1520 that I have, would love to have the upgrade from our Intel J4125 Celeron 9th Gen CPU to this newer, more efficient, and more powerful Intel N5105. This has a better iGPU in it than what our decent Synology NASs have, which makes this NAS perfectly capable of not only being a home Plex server, but sharing up remote media and being able to transcode when you need to. And that brings me to the Plex NAS compatibility guide. Well, what did I do? So here's Nicholas's NAS under this section of the spreadsheet. We can always just ignore the software transcoding side of it, because if you have to rely on software transcoding, you're buying the best i9 processor that you can find, the best brute force processor to be able to do as many software transcodes as you need. And that's never going to be many. But even a lowly Celeron processor like I have in my Synology NAS can do just what Nick's processor can do. So everything's a yes on all the transcoding columns except for the HEVC 4K columns. Now you can't rip a UHD Blu-ray disc and end up with H.264 content. It's all HEVC content on the disc. So some people mistake this column as meaning that this processor can't decode that. Well, even the latest best Intel iGPU is going to have the same info here. All this means is if you have an HEVC 1080p copy and you transcode it down to 720p, Plex will keep it in the HEVC format. If you have an H.264 4K video and Plex transcodes it, it will keep it in the H.264 format. So if you have a newer um, rip of a UHD Blu-ray CD or DVD or Blu-ray disc, and the base files inside are encoded with HEVC, Plex can transcode that easy peasy, but the transcoded stream is going to be converted to an H.264 output. This does not prevent a transcode. It does not make the transcode harder. It just changes the resulting container file to be in the H.264 content. So a lot of people get this wrong simply because it doesn't say yes. And you can test it. You can test it on like a Synology NAS, an older 9th gen Celeron processor, and a 13th gen i9. It's all the same principle. It's going to say H.264 content if you could find a NAS in the compatibility guide that had that latest i9 processor. So that's a limitation of QuickSync, and I don't think it's a limitation of NVINC, but I've never used transcoding off an NVIDIA GPU besides one test, and I don't have that set up to confirm my suspicions right now. So this is great. So let's just leave this in the background, and the rest of this video will be more like a podcast as I answer Nicholas's questions. So the first question was, he says, my NAS hosts the films and TV series as well as extras only. I have Exos drives in there, and it's in a room upstairs that can be noisy. So yes, your NAS hosts the media files, but it's also considered a server in its own right, and a pretty decent one where Plex server is concerned if you installed Plex on your NAS. So then he says he runs a Dell Optiplex 3070 SFF in his TV cabinet, and it has an i5 9500 CPU in it, as well as 16 gigabytes of RAM and a 1 terabyte SSD for Plex cache transcode, I think. So, Nick, your i5 CPU, your 9th gen i5 CPU is a great base for a Plex server that has a Plex pass attached to it because it's a decent iGPU that's built into the CPU for Plex hardware accelerated transcoding. But your NAS has an iGPU of equal performance built into its Celeron N5105 CPU. Hardware accelerated transcoding is really only a fail-safe feature used only when you need to get a stream to a client device that has either bandwidth limitation issues or compatibility issues with your media. Long story short, you can easily have your Plex server run trouble-free right on your NAS and not involve your Dell Optiplex at all, unless you wanted to install the Windows HTPC client app on it to plug into the PC, to plug that PC into your TV for viewing. The HTPC client app will require a keyboard attached, not a mouse, but you're probably already using a keyboard mouse combo with that system if you have it plugged into your TV as an optional device. And the HTPC client device is the premier client device under Windows, Mac, or Linux. It will direct play more media than almost any other client app besides the NVIDIA Shield or the Apple TV. And I'm talking about the newest Apple TV and not the first gen or even the second gen. The only thing I would recommend is you might want to upgrade the RAM in your NAS. I didn't look to see how much RAM this system has. When I was running Plex server on my Synology DS1520, I think it came with 4 gigabytes of RAM. I threw a 16 gigabyte chip into it for 20 gigabytes total, and not only did Plex function perfectly fine, I hit a lot of those automatic acquisition type of Docker containers running in the background, and it just did everything it was supposed to do without failure. I've since moved my Plex server only to an 11th gen NUC with a mobile version of the processor that has the fantastic Iris Xe graphics iGPU in it. I didn't really need to. It was kind of a vanity project, but that vanity project worked out so well. I've got a little rocket ship of a Plex server that points back to my Synology NAS, where those acquisition containers still run. Plex and Channels DVR running containers under Unraid, which is set up as a Docker host only install without any of its own network storage for media. And both those containers point back to my Synology NAS, which is very similar to what you're doing now. If my Synology NAS had your processor in it, I probably would have never played around with the experiment of Unraid on a NUC, because your iGPU is already about as powerful as I would think I'd ever need. Where my 9th gen Celeron with the iGPU in it was capable, but not as good as it could be. So just to throw that out, we're running similar setups, just a different operating system on the PC. And why I chose Unraid was because I could use two dissimilar drives, an NVMe drive and a SATA SSD like you'd have in a laptop, and put them into a RAID 1 configuration, which I'm using as an Unraid cache pool, which is where my Docker containers run. So if one of those dissimilar drives fails, just like my Synology NAS or just like your NAS, you can pop the drive out, and I'm sure you can hot swap on your NAS like I can on my Synology NAS. If I have a failed drive on my Synology NAS, I can pop the drive out without shutting it down or shutting down my Plex server, pop a replacement drive in, and it'll rebuild the array in the background. Well, my Unraid setup isn't hot swappable. I'll have to shut the unit down, but if I have one drive failure, it doesn't take down my Plex container, and I can shut the unit down, swap in a good drive, spend about 5 minutes in configuration with the Unraid OS, and then boot Plex back up as if nothing happened. So that's why I went with Unraid on my NUC, because of the redundancy of having any containers running on it being protected just through redundancy. And of course, I occasionally back that container up to my Synology NAS, so that gives me added protection in case the little unit started on fire. I can order another one or pull an old computer off the shelf and get things going under Unraid in a short period of time. So the key to this is, if a single drive fails, you don't lose your Plex data or your Plex server. On your Optiplex with a single SSD with Plex installed on it, if that SSD fails, you've lost your Plex server. So I don't really care if you switch to the NAS for your Plex install, but those are the benefits. And the iGPU in this is pretty much equivalent to the iGPU in your Optiplex to start with. So we do have to remember that hardware accelerated transcoding is really just a fail-safe feature, like I said. No one wants to turn it on, but you want it there as a feature when you need it. Let's see. So your third question really isn't a question. You just state you have a 1 terabyte SSD for Windows 11 OS. And then number 4, you say, I have ticked the box for the CPU to transcode, so if I'm correct, the NAS is the host and the PC is the server. So let's use some better terminology. Any Plex server install can use hardware accelerated transcoding if it has a compatible Intel iGPU or NVIDIA GPU and you have a Plex pass, but again, it's a fail-safe feature that only automatically turns on if the original stream can't get through to the client device for some reason. Again, your NAS is a file server that your PC, which then has Plex server installed on, connects to for the media on your NAS. The server-client relationship is between your PC when it's running Plex server and any and all client apps connected to your server with a Plex app installed on it. That relationship doesn't change the fact that your media is hosted on your NAS that's currently only being used as a file server for your Plex server install somewhere else to connect to. While I'm a pro with Synology NAS equipment, I've reviewed the Plex server install procedures for your NAS, and it looks very easy to get a Plex server going if that would interest you. So you say you're no good with things like Docker, Unraid, or Linux, so you chose the Windows option. You do actually want a Linux install of Plex server simply because it's so portable. While a Mac or Windows install, excuse me, that was my Amazon notification on my phone. While a Mac or a Windows install of Plex server can only be fully moved completely to a new system running the same OS. If you've made a million configuration changes with custom metadata and custom posters and custom collections on your current server, to keep all that without having to redo it, you need to move it to another Windows install. But when you read the words Docker container or Unraid, that's still just a Linux Plex server install that's running in a container. The Unraid OS is a Linux OS. My Synology DSM OS is a Linux OS. Whatever the OS on your NAS is called, that's a Linux OS. Linux is Linux is Linux is Linux is Linux. Our Linux machines and OSs may run different versions of the Linux kernel, but it's still all Linux. And Linux is just like this one big, it's like this one big list of ingredients. And when someone creates a distro, they decide what of these approved ingredients gets put into their baking of a Linux distro. But the underlying kernel is all the same, there's just different versions. And I may be running a bleeding edge kernel with my Linux distro, and you may be running one that's older and more stable. But eventually all the bugs are worked out of my bleeding edge, and through version updates to your Linux OS, you eventually will run the same Linux kernel that I'm just running earlier, because not every bug has been worked out of it yet. So the Linux kernel is monolithic, and you can just, which means it's huge and it's one thing, but each distro can pick what it wants to use from everything that's available to build the distro that they want. But the underlying kernel is just Linux. So this is a Linux machine. You're already using a Linux machine and you didn't know it. Now, a Docker container is a little sandbox bit of Linux code that has everything in it that it needs to run. On your computer, if you make a change to the Plex registry, your Plex server won't run. If I install Plex in Ubuntu as a manual install by using the .deb file, there may be some dependencies that get installed along with it. A Docker container under Linux, under Windows, or under Mac is all the same code. And it doesn't rely on any other code besides a Docker subsystem to run. So you make changes to the Windows registry, it shouldn't affect a Docker install under Windows. Some manual install under Ubuntu outside of the store that screws up another Linux program won't screw up the Docker container unless that other Linux program interfered with the whole Docker subsystem. So it's just an easier way to keep things installed and running without issues. And because they're portable, you can move a Docker container install to any OS. So you can't move a Windows or a Mac install to Linux without losing something. But any Linux install can be converted to a Docker container install, because Linux, again, is Linux as Linux is Linux. And then once it's in a Docker container install, now it can be moved to a Windows machine or a Mac running the Docker subsystem. The portability is only one way from Linux to those other operating systems if you're using Docker. If you do install Plex in a Docker container under Windows or Mac OS, then you have the same reverse portability, but a plain install under Windows or Mac can't be moved fully without losing something to either the other operating system or to Linux. So that's the biggest issue. You don't need Docker on this. You can use a regular package install because it's Linux. And then down the road, if Docker ever interested you, you can convert that. Most likely, that's what you do if you wanted to switch brands from this brand to, say, a QNAP or a Synology or even a self-built Unraid install. Let me see, where am I at now? So you really don't need to worry about Docker, but if you use the package install on this NAS, you can always convert to it. So you say you're not tech-minded with coding and commands. Now with the i5 CPU, does this support HDR via the Plex app, for example, on my Shield or Smart 4K TV? And I am planning on getting a Dolby Vision TV, so will the CPU support that via the Plex TV app? Do I need to upgrade the CPU to an i7 or i9 and also upgrade the RAM? So let's talk about the processor. The processor in this unit is good enough to do everything that you might want to do. You don't need an i7 or i9. You can simply move everything here, but you may not want to keep things on Windows on your Optiplex if HDR tone mapping is something you want. So it's only recently that a Windows Plex install has supported HDR tone mapping, while Linux has supported it for a while. But I'm not sure if all the Windows bugs are worked out. You have an existing install, you don't have to change, you can test that out for yourself. If I go into my server settings, so I have multiple servers running. This is my main server on the Intel running Unraid. This is where my friends and family are connected to. I have a test Unraid install that's still up. I made a video on that, and I'm waiting for some hardware to come in. I'm going to slide this install under new hardware to show that the Unraid operating system is portable. You can slide hardware under it, and new hardware back in. Then these are two test installs on each Synology NAS. So we're looking for tone mapping. So under the transcoder, I think. Nope, so this is where you enable transcoding. All right, I'm having a brain freeze at the moment. I'm looking for tone mapping. Is it under library? All right, so I've scripted some of my responses to your questions, but I don't always script everything. So let me pause this video while I find out where that is. My apologies. It was in the transcoder section under settings. Sometimes I can't see while I'm speaking. Right here, enable HDR tone mapping. So let's talk about that for a second. I'm not sure how well it's supported in all Windows installs right now, but it's not always perfect It's not always a perfect world in Linux land either. I've recently learned that a brand new install of Ubuntu 24.04 that just came out last month has an HDR tone mapping bug if you use Ubuntu as your base for a Plex server. And it only affects Intel iGPUs, not NVIDIA GPUs. If you enable HDR tone mapping under the new version of Ubuntu, and you transcode a stream, this setting will cause the hardware accelerated transcode on the iGPU to fail, forcing it to a software transcode, which is significantly more resource intensive and could cause buffering of a 4K stream if you don't have the latest greatest support for your local network, and if maybe you don't have the best processor. The iGPU is super powerful, and then if this happens, you're forced to use the brute strength of the CPU itself. Well, I have no worries about this issue being resolved. Either Plex will find how to adjust their code, or they'll find a bug in the new kernel that Ubuntu is using, and the next kernel update or the second to next kernel update will fix that. It's been very well supported under Linux, and if we go back to this, your NAS is not running the latest kernel that Ubuntu is. Any NAS kind of stays back on the Linux kernel because they want the ultimate in stability, and a kernel has to be tested for a long time before you'll have an OS update that updates to a new kernel. So that just won't be an issue tone mapping here. And most likely you may have a better tone mapping experience on this unit than keeping your Windows 11 install on your NAS. But I'm not a Windows guy, and I don't have a test version of Plex running under Windows right now to test that theory out for you with an Intel iGPU. So you've got the server set up, you can find that out yourself once you upgrade to that. What I do want to talk about is, let's see, the language you use, Dolby Vision TV. So depending on your device will depend on the success of a direct stream of higher quality Plex media to the client device. Now, the NVIDIA Shield or the HTPC client app should be able to handle everything and do its best to keep it direct. I can tell you right now, people who live in the Roku world, Roku's almost always force a transcode of the audio portion unless there's an audio video receiver or a sound bar involved. So that probably will be the same case with your proprietary Samsung app, and I can't beg you enough to just simply abandon that. Abandon the Samsung app and never look back. Pretend your Samsung TV never had any smarts to it, and use your NVIDIA Shield there. Put the HTPC client app on your Dell Optiplex and use that as your Plex client. Go out to Walmart and buy the second gen ONN Google TV box for $20, $19.99. That's 10 times the Plex app than your built-in Samsung app. Just don't use it. It's weird to argue with a friend. You invite them to your server, they love your Plex server, but they think it stinks because it buffers on their Samsung app. And no matter how many times you tell them to buy a cheap Walmart device, buy this device, buy that device, they think because they paid a lot of money for their Samsung TV and it has a beautiful picture that it couldn't possibly have any defects. Well, it does. I have a few people using LG TVs, and while you never quite know the age of someone's TV, I don't have any transcoding on my server from people using LG TVs. But I've had a couple people with Samsung TVs, and 3 actually, and 2 have switched, and 1 doesn't complain. I have sent them messages. Look, if you got some buffer going on, it's your Samsung TV. It's a guaranteed fix by switching the streaming device, but if they're happy and they don't complain, I'm happy. So the new TV may or may not have a Plex client app that works. Again, the LG seems to work pretty fine. If the TV is a new Sony with built-in Google TV, that should have enough resources to work fine for you. Another Samsung TV, abandon the app completely, even on a brand new TV. So let's talk about the possibility of moving to this device. Because you've got a Windows install, no matter what you do, you are going to lose any custom artwork, any custom collections you've made, any smart collections you've made, and any playlists you've made. And that would be the price of admission to then redoing all that on a new Plex server, to then be able to move it anywhere you want it in the future, guaranteed, without any loss of custom metadata that you've done to your server. If your Windows computer dies tomorrow, you're starting fresh anyway, unless you have a full backup of everything you need to recreate things. It's not hard to back up a little Docker container. It's really not hard to back up a package install on a NAS either. I know how to do it with a Synology NAS, and probably with the right resources I could figure out that it's easy to do on your brand of NAS also. So, not that I'm pushing, but this is the future if you want a trouble-free experience and the easiest experience to restore back from. So then you say you can play 4K films fine most of the times, and then sometimes it will buffer, and that you have roughly speed test of 950 megabits per second download according to speedtest.net, and that your upload is around 90 megabits per second. So that's telling me you have somebody like a Spectrum that has upgraded to gig service incoming but not outgoing. You have plenty of incoming bandwidth to download Plex server, but your incoming bandwidth has absolutely nothing to do with serving up local Plex streams. A gig outgoing connection would allow you to share Plex media with friends and family, and most likely no one would have to force your server to transcode unless they had client device compatibility issues on their end. But that's a gig outgoing connection that you don't have. An outgoing connection that is more limited to your 90 megabit per second speed test result may allow you to share lower bit rated material with 3 or 4 remote friends, but you're not ever going to direct stream a complex 4K media stream whose bit rate approaches 100 megabits per second or could be as high as 130, 150. That's always going to force a transcode off your server. So you've got that outgoing bandwidth limitation, and it really doesn't matter what your incoming bandwidth is for local streams, because all Plex server is doing is retrieving information about your media when it makes a match. It's pulling in metadata just for the match. It's not using the internet connection at all, besides to verify the app. And of course you need an internet connection to check in with the web-based server app.plextv. But a slow connection versus a speedy connection doesn't affect performance on your local network with client devices. Your local networking infrastructure is what's the most important, and a good local foundation helps promote getting remote streams out as efficiently as your outgoing bandwidth will allow. You don't mention any of that, but you'd probably want your ISP equipment to connect to a gig network switch, or even a 2.5 or 5 gigabyte network switch. In case your ISP ever upgrades, you'd be all set to take better advantage of the faster Ethernet port in this I mean, this looks like a really good NAS to me. It's got good specs. But even just start with a gig switch, because that's all you have to the outside world, and that's plenty fast enough for local streams anyway. And then your home router or mesh system is what's important for most Plex client apps, because most client apps don't have a gig Ethernet port. So a wireless router that has Wi-Fi 6 or better works better with more modern streaming devices. The latest Walmart device, the ONN Google TV Pro, I think that has Wi-Fi 6 on it, and I think some of the newer Fire Sticks have Wi-Fi 6. I think older Rokus a couple of years ago, they still sold cheap Rokus that didn't even have a 5 gigahertz connection to the local network, and they were stuck on 2.4. So you need that local infrastructure, and sometimes a router upgrade is a nice thing to do for your local streams. But then we have to talk about Ethernet ports. Any TV, and I don't care if it's my $3,000 65-inch OLED Sony, your Samsung TV, or any TV, they all have Ethernet ports limited to 100 megabits per second. And that's where a lot of people mess up. They think, oh, I've got this TV, Ethernet's always better. Well, even the TV might have a Wi-Fi 5 wireless connection, which might have twice or almost 3 times the bandwidth of the limited 100 megabit per second Ethernet port. So never plug a TV into the Ethernet port unless it's so far from your router it can't get a good 5 gigahertz connection. And you will buffer 4K streams if your client device is plugged into a limited Ethernet port, because the bit rate can easily exceed 100 megabits per second. The only client devices with a gig Ethernet port is any NVIDIA Shield model. Currently, you can only buy the NVIDIA Shield Pro that has a gig Ethernet port, or you can buy the regular NVIDIA Shield that I call the tube style Shield that has a gig Ethernet port in it too. The new ONN Pro device from Walmart, very nice device, limited to 100 megabits per second on its Ethernet port. All versions of the Fire TV Cube, 100 megabit per second Ethernet port. The Roku Ultra lines, they have an Ethernet port, limited to 100 megabits per second. So it's counterintuitive to think that you shouldn't use the Ethernet port in your device, but it's a limited Ethernet port, so don't use it. Your NVIDIA Shield, you want to connect that. Well, you want to connect your ISP's networking equipment to a gig network switch, and then you use a Cat6 cable to connect your NAS, and use a Cat6 cable to connect your NVIDIA Shield, and you use a Cat6 cable to connect your Dell Optiplex, which also has a gig Ethernet port. Now you've got the best local networking infrastructure to support any stream. And again, this is ready for an upgrade. If your ISP upgrades you to 5 gigabyte service, you can grab a 2.5 gigabyte switch. They're more expensive. Connect this to it. It won't change the limitation of the gig connection on your Optiplex or your NVIDIA Shield, but this can better support multiple high-end streams because it just has a faster gig connection to your local network. So hopefully that all makes sense. And again, if with portable devices, you want to connect to the 5 gigahertz side of your router. If your router supports Wi-Fi 6 or Wi-Fi 6E, newer devices are starting to have those higher connection speeds also. And that just means more throughput for higher end media, and more throughput means a less likelihood of a transcode being forced because of bandwidth issues. So you say your Samsung TV struggles with VC1 encodes to get media play. I don't know where you're getting the VC1 encodes from anyway. Most things should be in either the H.264 format or the H.265, which is really HEVC also. Newer devices are starting to support AV1. You are going to see everything moving in that direction eventually, because everybody has to pay royalties for H.264 or H.265. Companies like Google and Apple and others all banded together to come up with the AV1 codec to get rid of paying royalties to someone else. So they all banded together and just said, we're going to use this so we don't have to keep paying the royalties. And eventually, everything's going to move that way. Let me see. I think my NVIDIA Shield supports AV1, but older devices just aren't. Maybe a newer Fire Stick supports it, but a second Gen 4K Max may not. I'm not an expert on all that, but nobody has to be, because streaming devices are cheap. When all of them support AV1, and that becomes what's used in a new Blu-ray release or a new DVD release, that's the point it'll matter to all of us. And again, even if you have a setup that can't support it, well, you can rip a Blu-ray, and if it's in the AV1 format, you can convert it with Handbrake back to H.265 or H.264. And supposedly the compression is better on AV1 too, so it means the same quality for a smaller file size. So again, I don't know what VC1 is, and I don't know where your media has that, but if you're converting to that, you might want to convert to H.265 or HEVC. H.264 is the widest compatible across all Plex client devices. So if you're going to have a cousin on your server using an old Roku who will never upgrade, and they're too far away from you to bring them an inexpensive ONN device from Walmart, well, the H.265 encoded media is going to play best on their old Roku device. But I'm of the position that, I'm a nice guy that shares my server with friends and family. If you have problems because you're using an old device, it's not something I can fix about, nor is it something I really want to hear you bitch about. I'm not the old man that says like it or leave it, but I am the guy that says, look, I've told you 2 or 3 times that your device is the issue. No matter how much you like your device, you're going to grow to like your new device. And just because Netflix or Hulu works for you, and you don't understand that it's not as high quality of a stream as my Plex server might be, that's all a you issue, and you get to be you. But the minute you want a better experience, simply follow my advice and I'll help you get that better experience. But I can't help someone be pig-headed, and people get to think what they want to think, including myself, including you, which is why my advice is only advice. Then you say that you're, hold on. Before I go further, the VC1 was in reference to your Samsung TV app. And if I haven't said it 3 or 4 times already, stop using the proprietary Plex app on your Samsung TV. No good ever comes from it. Just stop. Enjoy the nice picture on your Samsung TV. If you love the TV for that, keep loving it. But you've got HDMI ports on it to get rid of the poorly implemented Plex client app that won't have the same updates as a Fire Stick, a Google TV device, a Roku. I'm not a fan of Rokus for many reasons, so I never suggest them. But if you absolutely love the Roku interface, buy the latest and greatest Roku Ultra, and make sure you have a sound bar or a good audio video receiver plugged into the HDMI ARC port of your TV, and then you'll have a trouble-free direct stream experience. All right, then you go on to say that you are direct playing in your home on the same network via Ethernet. However, the device that are on Wi-Fi in the house states remote connections. When you look at the connections via the Plex web app, it states direct play with, which is strange to you. I love that you know how to use the dashboard feature of the web app to see how a stream is playing. I absolutely love that. Too many people don't know how to check in on their own streams. So let's expand the universe here. All local Plex client devices are local and never a remote device. Remember, Plex has a server-client relationship where the client devices can be on either a local or a remote network. Your Plex server installed on your Optiplex is the Plex server. All your home client devices that run a Plex app are local devices. If you give your cousin Ed access to your Plex server from 3 states away, his device will be your first remote client device attached to your server. So the server can have local and remote client devices, and every single device that's on your local network is a local device. That's why it's a local network versus a remote network. So the local clients and remote clients depend on whether they're on one network or the other. So then you say you hope your questions made sense. They actually did. They're great questions for anyone new to Plex to ask and to understand. They made complete sense. They were great ones. I simply thought that a video, which really is more of a podcast, would be a better way to answer all those questions than typing all this out and having to put it in 2 or 3 replies to fit it under Facebook's constraints. And the last thing I want to talk about is if you decide to move to this, which I would, if I had this NAS, well, let's say if my Synology NAS had your CPU in it, I probably would have never moved to my NUC to run Plex on, because this is, not only is it good enough, it's got a great iGPU in it. I could keep everything in-house. I know nothing about how this infrastructure is set up besides the fact that it's Linux. I love the Synology NAS ecosystem. Absolutely love it. I think it's fantastic. The only downfall is they don't put the best processor in to use the media server. The Celeron CPU I have came out in 2019, and of course my NAS is a 2020 model. So that's understandable. But Synology is still using that same processor in the DS423 and the 224 Plus NASs. And you know, both of those should have had an upgraded CPU just like your NAS does. This would be plenty enough for me, and I have 20 remote friends and family that I share with. 10 are fairly active, and the other 10 just stream occasionally. The most I've had on my server is 13 streams going at once, including 2 local streams. And again, almost all of my media direct streams, I'm not sharing 4K, but I direct stream because I have the gig outgoing connection through a fiber connection, so it's gig up and down. And the only devices that transcode, it's always an audio device, or it's always an audio transcode and not the video transcode. And it's always one of my users using a Samsung TV, there's only one left, or a Roku device, and I only have a couple of them. Apple TV stream fine, my NVIDIA equipment stream fine. People that I've recommended to use either a Fire Stick, an NVIDIA Shield, or one of the newer Walmart ON devices, they stream fine. TiVo Stream 4K devices used to stream fine. So your local networking is the answer. This is a good unit to move Plex server if you want to. You don't have to, but eventually you may want to. And the last thing I have to say, if you do want to move to this device, I do have some good tips on how you might better organize your media on your NAS. I don't know how it's set up. You should have one network shared folder for all your Plex media. And I can actually show that before I end this, my recommendation. Well, I thought I was under Pop OS. I'm using this as a cleaner experience for this video. If I go into my local file manager and I click on other locations, I'm going to show you one of my test installs that's all set up with
you have an informational message
with public domain media. So if I go into this NAS, here's one shared media folder. And because Plex has 5 different types of libraries, I've created a library sort folder for each. Movies-libraries, music-libraries, other-libraries, photo-libraries, TV-libraries. Inside this movie library sort folder, I have some individual test things, and this was for some other experiment. Let me put that back where it belongs. Well, it already has it, so let me just delete that. So 4K media can be separated into its own folder to then point a Plex library at it. You can sort out documentaries if you want. You can create a special one for just anything DVR'd. If you have DVR set up with Plex, here's a kids movie library. Here's one I use as a main movie library. And of course this test is obvious. And the same with the TV library sort folder. If you wanted the main movie library, you can have it. One for kids, one for DVR, and even one for anime, so all your content does not have to be mixed together. And this way, if you are sharing with friends and family, or you might do that in the future, well, friends who have little kids might want to have this pinned near the top, or maybe restrict one of their devices from being able to access anything but this. If you have friends who love anime and you have an anime collection, they could pin that library to the top or unpin it so they don't see it, and people without kids could unpin this library to not see it. And the same with the movie library. I have a couple friends or family members who love my documentary collection, but they don't have little kids, they don't have little grandkids, so they can unpin this and maybe pin this third in spot. Maybe they'll pin the movie library, the TV show library, and then the documentary movie library. I have a concert library folder. I have a stand-up library folder, and I have a performing arts library folder for, live stage type of stuff. So if they release, I don't know, I'm trying to think of a famous stage play I'm trying to think of the Revolutionary War one right now, Hamilton. When Hamilton came out on DVD or Blu-ray, if you have a lot of that type of content ripped, you could put it in its separate library folder. And I have 2 friends or family members that loves that kind of stuff. So it allows a lot of customization. Plus, it sets yourself up to just have the one shared media folder instead of creating a shared media folder for movies and a shared media folder for TV shows and a shared media folder for music. Everything can be in one neat nested location, and this allows for the ultimate and expandability of your server if you want to add additional content and want some better structuring. Because nobody should look at a main movie library and see a lot of movies made for toddlers. It just, it just shouldn't happen. Nor when you're searching for appropriate movies for your 5-year-old, do you want to see a lot of slasher films from the main movie library. So this, to me, just makes sense. and I can help ask or answer any questions on this subject, and I can probably help you get a default Plex server install going. But the video I shared from NAS Compares is a pretty good video in itself, and I came across another written tutorial that had pictures of every screen for your brand of NAS to install Plex server. So again, let's end this with, you don't have to change, but you don't really need to run Plex on your Dell running Windows. If you still want that in your TV cabinet, you can, but that's like, what is it, 2003 thinking with the old Plex Windows Media program. You don't need a computer tied to your TV when you have a fabulous base like you do. So this is 2024 thinking. The computer tied to your TV is 2003 thinking. Like when lots of us had a Kodi install on a PC connected to our TV to use Kodi as a media server. Ditch that model, you'll be happier with this. But if you don't want to change, no one's forcing you. I just want you to have the information that this is easy to change to if you ever need to or simply decide it's better for you. So Nicholas, good luck. I know this is long. I apologize for that. But you had a lot of questions, and I want to thank you because your questions became a fun topic for me to make a video on that hopefully could inform some other people besides just you. So happy Plexing, and definitely let me know what direction you move in or if you stay the same. And if I haven't explained everything clearly to you, feel free to reach out and I'll try to come up with a better answer that works for you. Everyone else, happy Plexing.